Hi there. This is a short video for faculty that are beginning to teach an engineering design course. In this video, we're going to talk about some guidelines for faculty to follow in selecting projects to include in their course, the sponsors to provide those projects, and how to present those projects to your students at the beginning of your course. I'm Bryce Pills. I teach at the law school in a program called the Entrepreneurship Clinic. Teaching an engineering design course can be extremely difficult. You need to work to find sponsors for your projects, and then you need to balance the interest between those sponsors to make it attractive for them to bring their projects to your course and to preserve their legitimate business and legal interests, and the interests of your students, who you want to expose to these third parties, but you want to also make sure are being treated fairly from a business and a legal perspective. Through the years here at the university, we've learned a number of lessons that have led to the formation of these guidelines. The first guideline is that, generally speaking, you want to limit the number of projects in your course that require the students to sign a legal agreement with the sponsoring party, whether it's a confidentiality agreement or especially an intellectual property assignment or license agreement. The reason behind this guideline is that, generally speaking, it's good for students to have the opportunity, if they want, at the end of the course, to continue working with the technology they've created during the design course, perhaps to exploit it through a startup venture or perhaps to use it in some other avenue. And projects that require the students to sign a legal agreement, generally speaking, limit the freedom of those students to use the technology after the course is over. And in many cases, outside companies can live with an arrangement that doesn't require them to fully own all the intellectual property or for the students to abide by strict confidentiality obligations. In most cases, these outside parties aren't bringing highly sensitive, highly proprietary projects into an undergraduate or graduate design course. The second guideline is that it's important to fully identify to the students what projects will require the students to sign a legal agreement, either a confidentiality or an intellectual property license or assignment agreement, with the sponsoring party. The reason behind this is that many students, as you can imagine, come into a course with entrepreneurial ambitions, or at least they want to preserve the flexibility that after the end of the course, they can continue to work with the technology they've worked hard during the course to develop. So the students may want to know what projects are going to require this IP assignment so they can choose another project. The third guideline sort of relates to the second in that the students should have an option to work on both projects that require an assignment or confidentiality obligation to be assigned to the third party and projects that don't require any legal agreement to be signed with the sponsoring party. Again, this is so students can clearly see what projects will require these legal documents to be signed and have the option to work on a project that at the end of the term the students would own their own intellectual property and have the ability to pursue entrepreneurial endeavors based on that project. The fourth guideline is that for projects where there is a requirement that the students sign a legal agreement, such as a confidentiality agreement or an IP license or assignment, that those agreements should be disclosed to the students at the beginning of the course, and the students should sign those agreements and complete the execution of those agreements before beginning to work on the course project. This allows for the agreements to be signed and provided to the sponsor, whether it's an external sponsor or the University of Michigan if it's an internal sponsor, before any valuable intellectual property is generated. In some cases, there have been disputes that have arisen where the students have known about the requirement to sign a legal agreement with the sponsor, but aren't presented with that agreement to the end of the course. And at the end of the course, as you can imagine, the students have worked really hard on the project, have a heightened sense of their achievement and the value of the projects, and sometimes can be a bit antagonistic and highly scrutinize any agreement that's presented to them at that point. It's better to get these legal agreements completed at the beginning of the course, and so that any questions by the students, any disagreements with the documents can be ironed out before valuable intellectual property is generated. The fifth guideline is that whenever possible, you should use U of M's form legal agreements that have been created for its engineering design courses. The University of Michigan, through its design course faculty toolkit, has vetted a number of agreements that has deemed to be generally fair to both the sponsor and to the students, and that it won't have any surprise clauses. These agreements provide a nice, neutral, fair document that can be used for any agreements between the sponsor and students or the university and students. So whenever possible, it should be made clear to the sponsoring party that U of M wants the U of M form agreements to be used because U of M believes these to be a fair, neutral way of governing confidentiality obligations or from transferring intellectual property rights from a student to a sponsoring party. The sixth guideline is that even in projects where the students are going to own their own intellectual property rights, in other words, where there's no legal agreements that the students are asked to sign with the sponsoring party, there still can be disputes over ownership of intellectual property. That's because, generally speaking, with students, it's the individual creator that's going to be the initial owner of the intellectual property rights. So with team-based projects, there could be multiple students involved in the creation of any invention during the course of the project, and therefore multiple joint owners. And disputes can arise between the students as to ownership of intellectual property and the rights and obligations of various students to continue on with the project at the end of the course. One of our faculty years ago created a document called the Play Nice Letter. The Play Nice Letter is something that can be provided to the students working on course projects even where they're not asked to sign a legal document with a sponsor. And it's a general agreement between the students as to what are the rules about intellectual property ownership and what are the rights and obligations for each student at the close of the semester and when they're trying to decide how to proceed with those that are going to work on the project and those that are not going to continue to work on the project at the close of the semester. Again, this is the Play Nice Letter. It's also available on the Engineering Design course Faculty Toolkit, and it's a good document to use in those projects, even when there's no legal agreement that's required to be signed with the sponsor. The seventh guideline is to beware of the notion of public disclosures. Public disclosures refer to when an inventor or some other party discloses to the public the specifics of an invention before the inventor has had a chance to file a patent application on that invention. Public disclosures before a patent application has been filed can negatively impair the patent rights in that invention. Generally speaking, for a US patent, they start a 1-year clock running in order to file a US patent or lose one's patent rights. And in foreign jurisdictions, such as Europe, one is barred from ever getting a patent if they publicly disclose the invention prior to filing a patent application. There are things in the university setting that may constitute public disclosures, such as the end of semester design expo. So it's important to make sure the students are aware of the issue of public disclosures, and that especially for projects that are sponsored by external or internal sponsors, where there may be valuable patent rights that the sponsor is expecting to be able to commercialize and exploit thereafter, that the sponsors are aware that there may be a public disclosure at the end of the semester, and that the sponsor should assume, in fact, that any invention created during the course will be publicly disclosed, and that the students are aware of this issue so that any steps that need to be taken to avoid a public disclosure impairing important patent rights can be taken prior to that happening. So those are 7 general guidelines that we suggest faculty follow in structuring and implementing their design course. So while people talk about intellectual property or even ownership of an idea, what we really care about from a legal standpoint is the specific categories of intellectual property. And I like to talk about